On a gray morning in October 1943, in the heart of Nazi-occupied Warsaw, the sound of German boots echoed down the second-floor corridor of a modest primary school on Marszałkowska Street. The building was not remarkable. 3 stories of weathered brick, tall windows overlooking cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, classrooms that smelled of chalk dust and old wood. But the woman standing at the blackboard in room 7 was about to perform the most dangerous lesson of her life. Barbara Kaminska, 34 years old, wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose, a piece of white chalk held steady in ink-stained fingers, did not look toward the door as the footsteps grew louder. Instead, she continued writing conjugations on the board in her careful script, listening to the sound of 12 children behind her singing a Polish folk song in perfect unison. What the approaching Gestapo officer, Hauptmann Ernst Zimmermann, did not know was that beneath the floorboards directly under Barbara's desk lay 17 sets of forged identity papers for Jewish children. What he could not see was the false-backed cabinet in the storage room behind him where 3 resistance fighters had been hiding without moving for the past 40 minutes. And what he would never suspect was that the most ordinary-looking woman in occupied Poland was running one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in the city. This is the story you were never taught in school. It is not about partisans in the forest or soldiers with rifles. It is about a woman with a teaching certificate who looked at evil walking through her door every week and decided that grammar lessons and mathematics drills were worth less than the lives she could save. By the time the war ended, Barbara Kaminska had forged documents for dozens of Jewish families, transmitted critical intelligence that saved hundreds of lives, and turned her classroom into a secret school where Polish identity survived when the Nazis tried to erase it from existence. She did this while German officers inspected her school. She did this while teaching the sanitized, approved curriculum during the day and the forbidden truth at night. And she did this knowing that discovery meant not just her own execution, but the deaths of every student who had trusted her, every family she had helped, and every resistance fighter whose life depended on her silence. If you stay with me until the end of this story, you will discover how an ordinary schoolteacher became an extraordinary spy, why her operation remained undetected for 3 years, and what the former students said when they visited her decades later, bringing their children to meet the woman who had saved their parents with nothing more than a forger's pen and a teacher's steady nerve. To understand what Barbara risked, you need to understand what Warsaw looked like in 1942. Barbara Kaminska had never wanted to be a hero. She had wanted to be a teacher, which in pre-war Poland meant something specific and sacred. It meant standing in front of rows of children and opening their minds to the music hidden inside language, to the way Mickiewicz could make you weep with a single stanza, to the precision required to solve an equation that had only one true answer. She had graduated from Warsaw University in 1932 with honors in Polish literature and pedagogy, her thesis on the Romantic poets earning praise from professors who saw in her a rare combination of intellectual rigor and genuine warmth. By 1935, she had her own classroom in a school on Marszałkowska Street, where she taught children ages 10 to 14 the difference between a simile and a metaphor, the proper conjugation of irregular verbs, and why Slovatsky's words about Polish wings mattered even in a modern world of motor cars and radio. Her students loved her because she never talked down to them. She quoted poetry the way other people quoted the weather, naturally and without pretension. She kept a small collection of books in her classroom that students could borrow freely, volumes of Norwood and Konopnicka, stories by Sienkiewicz, even a worn copy of Pan Tadeusz that had belonged to her father. On Friday afternoons, if lessons went well, she would read aloud to them, her voice steady and clear, transforming the cramped classroom into forests and battlefields and the great halls of Polish history. She believed, with the certainty of someone who had never been tested, that education was the quiet work of building a better world, one child at a time. She believed in the power of patience, of carefully planned lessons, of treating each student as a person worthy of respect and high expectations. She believed that knowledge, once given, could never be taken away. September 1st, 1939, taught her otherwise. The bombs began falling on Warsaw at dawn. Barbara was walking to school, her leather satchel heavy with the essays she had graded the night before, when the air raid sirens began their wail. She stood frozen on the street corner as the Luftwaffe's Stukas screamed overhead, as the ground shook, as smoke began to rising from the direction of the old town. Around her, people ran for shelter, but she could only think of one thing. Her classroom was on the second floor, and the windows faced east, and if a bomb hit the school, there would be nowhere for the children to hide. She ran toward the building, not away from it. By the time she arrived, breathless and terrified, the first wave had passed. The school was intact, but the city around it was burning. And Barbara Kaminska, who had spent 7 years teaching children about the beauty of Polish language and the nobility of Polish history, understood with sudden and terrible clarity that everything she had believed about the quiet dignity of her profession had just become obsolete. The war had come, and teaching, she realized as she stood in her empty classroom watching smoke darken the September sky, would never mean the same thing again. The knock came at 5 in the morning in a January day in 1941, when the cold was so brutal that ice had formed on the inside of Barbara's windows. She woke to the sound, disoriented, her breath visible in the darkness of her small apartment. For a moment she thought it might be the Gestapo. They preferred dawn raids, when people were still confused by sleep and more likely to make mistakes. But the knock came again, quieter this time, almost apologetic. Barbara pulled her wool coat over her nightgown and opened the door to find Sarah Rosenblum shivering on the landing. She barely recognized her former student. Sarah had been 15 the last time Barbara had seen her, a bright girl with an aptitude for mathematics and a laugh that carried across the schoolyard. That had been 2 years ago, before the occupation, before the ghetto walls went up. Now Sarah was 17, gaunt, wearing a thin coat and the yellow star sewn on her chest. Her eyes were the eyes of someone much older. "Pani Kaminska," Sarah whispered, using the formal address that Polish students gave their teachers. "I'm sorry, I didn't know where else to go." Barbara pulled her inside, glancing down the stairwell before closing the door. The building was quiet, but in occupied Warsaw, you never knew who was listening. She made Sarah sit by the small stove, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and waited. The story came out in fragments. Sarah's family, her parents, her younger brother, her grandmother, were still in the ghetto, but the deportations had begun. Trains leaving for places whose names people whispered but didn't fully understand. Treblinka, Auschwitz. Sarah had managed to slip out through a gap in the wall, risking execution just to cross the city to Barbara's apartment. She needed papers, false identity documents that would say her family was Catholic, Polish, not Jewish. Documents that might let them disappear into the general population, into the countryside, anywhere but where they were. "I know it's dangerous," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I know what they do to people who help us. But Pani, you taught us that words matter. You taught us that names and papers and documents mean something. I hoped, maybe you would know someone who could help." Barbara sat very still. She knew what Sarah was asking without asking. She knew that saying yes meant crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Forging documents was a capital offense. Helping Jews hide was a capital offense.
If caught, Barbara wouldn't face prison. She would face a wall and a firing squad, and so would anyone who lived in her building, because that was how the Germans enforced their orders: collective punishment, collective terror. She thought of all the reasons to say no. She was just a school teacher. She had no connections to the underground, no training in forgery work, no experience in resistance work. She wasn't brave. She had spent the first year of occupation keeping her head down, teaching the approved curriculum, trying to survive in a city that was slowly starving. Saying yes would mean risking everything for a cause that might be already lost. But she looked at Sarah's face, at the yellow star sewn on her coat, and she thought about Friday afternoons reading poetry to students who believed that words could change the world. "I'll help you," Barbara said quietly, and with those 3 words, the teacher she had been died, and someone else was born in her place.
Barbara had always thought of her school as a sanctuary, a place where children came to learn and grow. Now she had to teach herself to see it differently, not as a building, but as a weapon. Every room became a question. Every closet, every corner, every loose floorboard became a possibility. The supply closet was the first transformation. It was barely larger than a confessional, wedged between her classroom and the hallway, filled with chalk boxes, outdated textbooks, and cleaning supplies that no one had touched in months. Barbara emptied it one Sunday when the building was deserted, working by candlelight because using electric lamps would draw attention. She built a false back using spare boards from the damaged 3rd floor, creating a space just deep enough for a small table, a lamp, and the tools of forgery. Blank identity cards acquired through a contact Sarah had given her, official stamps stolen from unmanned offices, inks mixed to match government documents precisely. She practiced for weeks before attempting her first forgery, filling notebooks with copied signatures and official seals until her hand could reproduce them without thinking. The work was painstaking, requiring the same attention to detail she had once given to grading essays. A single misplaced letter, one shade of ink too dark, and the document would be worse than useless. It would be a death sentence. The school library became her dead drop. It was a small room on the 1st floor that students rarely used anymore, since most of the books had been confiscated or burned. Barbara began leaving messages inside specific volumes: Konopnitska's poems for intelligence about German troop movements, Sienkiewicz's historical novels for requests from families needing papers. Resistance couriers, posing as parents checking out books for their children, would retrieve the messages and leave new instructions in return. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Books were meant to be borrowed and returned, and German soldiers who occasionally patrolled the building had no interest in Polish literature they couldn't read. The basement coal room became a hiding place. Barbara discovered that the far wall, supposedly solid brick, was actually a facade covering an old storage space from when the building had served as a merchant's warehouse decades earlier. She cleared the space behind the wall, smuggling in blankets, water, a chamber pot, and a tin of matches. It was cramped, airless, and cold enough to see your breath even in summer. But it was invisible, and invisibility was worth more than comfort. Learning to use these spaces meant learning to think like someone hunted. Barbara began arriving at school an hour early to check for signs of disturbance, for footprints in dust that shouldn't be there, for books returned to wrong shelves. She memorized the patrol schedules of German soldiers who walked past the building. She learned which floorboards creaked and voided them. She trained herself to appear bored during inspections, to yawn at precisely the right moment, to make her classroom seem like the most tedious place in occupied Warsaw. The architecture of deception required more than physical spaces. It required rebuilding herself as well, board by board, until the woman who stood at the blackboard teaching grammar was just another false wall concealing what lay beneath. The hardest decision Barbara ever made wasn't risking her own life. It was deciding which children to ask to risk theirs. She watched them carefully for months before approaching anyone, watched how they moved through the occupied city, how they responded to German soldiers on the street, whether they could keep their faces neutral when something terrible happened in front of them. She looked for children who were old enough to understand consequences, but young enough that soldiers might dismiss them as harmless. She looked for steady hands and quiet voices and the ability to lie convincingly, which was a terrible thing to look for in a 14-year-old. Tomas was the first. He was tall for his age, with worker's hands and a face that could pass for 16 or 17. He came from a family of printers, and Barbara had noticed how he moved through crowds, purposefully but without drawing attention. One afternoon, after the other students had left, she asked him to stay behind to discuss his mathematics homework. Instead, she told him what she was doing, watching his face for fear, for hesitation, for the moment he might decide to turn her in for a bag of sugar or a German commendation. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need me to carry?" She started him with simple tasks, delivering sealed envelopes to addresses she wrote on scraps of paper that he memorized and then burned. The envelopes contained forged documents, intelligence reports, coded messages to other resistance cells. She taught him how to walk, not too fast, not too slow, never looking behind him. She taught him what to do if stopped, play stupid, act confused, have a plausible story ready about running an errand for his mother. She taught him that the best hiding place was often no hiding place at all, that papers tucked visibly into a school book were less suspicious than papers hidden in secret pockets. Within 6 months, she had recruited 8 students. Zofia, who was small and innocent-looking and could cry on command, making soldiers uncomfortable enough to wave her through checkpoints without thorough searches. Pyotr, who had a talent for mimicry and could adopt different accents and mannerisms depending on which neighborhood he was moving through. Halina, the youngest at 13, who delivered messages by pretending to sell black market cigarettes, a cover so common that German soldiers barely glanced at her. Barbara kept their knowledge compartmentalized. Tomas didn't know about Zofia's roots. Halina didn't know where the forgery workshop was. If one was captured and interrogated, they could only betray what they knew, and what they knew was deliberately incomplete. It was a cold calculus, treating children like pieces in a chess game where capture meant torture and execution. She told herself it was necessary. She told herself they volunteered, that they understood the risks, that they were choosing to fight in the only way available to them. But late at night, lying awake in her cold apartment, she thought about their parents who didn't know what their children were doing, about the futures she was gambling with, about the fact that she was teaching them skills no child should ever need to learn. And every morning she stood at the front of her classroom and taught them grammar and mathematics and tried not to think about which of them might not survive to graduation.
By 1942, the German occupation authorities had made their intentions clear. Polish children would be educated just enough to count, to follow orders, to serve. Nothing more. The curriculum Barbara was required to teach had been stripped of everything that made it Polish. No mention of Copernicus or Chopin, no Polish history beyond what was necessary to demonstrate German superiority. Literature was reduced to simple readers with stories about obedient children and the benevolence of the Reich. Barbara taught it flawlessly. She stood at the blackboard each morning and delivered lessons on German vocabulary, on basic arithmetic, on the geography of the Greater German Reich. She asked students to recite the names of German leaders and the dates of German victories. She corrected their pronunciation when they stumbled over German words. She even kept a portrait of Hitler on the wall, hung exactly where the regulations specified. During inspections, which came without warning every few weeks, their students performed perfectly.
They recited their lessons in monotone voices, eyes downcast, demonstrating exactly the kind of subdued compliance the authorities wanted to see. Hauptmann Zimmermann, who conducted most of the inspections, would walk between the rows of desks, listening to children repeat propaganda about the new order and the destiny of the German people. He never stayed long. Boredom, Barbara had learned, was her greatest ally. But after dark, when curfew had emptied the streets and the building was officially closed, Barbara taught a different curriculum entirely. They came in small groups, never more than 6 students at a time, slipping through a back entrance that Barbara left unlocked. They climbed the stairs in darkness, knowing every creak and groan of the old building, and gathered in her classroom, where Barbara had covered the windows with blankets and placed a single candle on her desk. Here she taught them who they really were. She taught them Polish history as it actually happened, not the sanitized version the Germans permitted. She taught them about the partitions and the uprisings, about Kosciuszko and Swolocki, about the battles lost and the dignity maintained. She taught them poetry, the real poetry, Mickiewicz and Swolocki and Norvid, the words that had been banned because the Germans understood that a people who could recite their own poets could never be fully conquered. The students copied everything into notebooks they kept hidden, memorizing passages in case the written words were discovered. Barbara would recite entire stanzas from memory, her voice barely above a whisper, and the children would repeat them back until the rhythms were embedded in their minds like prayers. She taught them that education was not about obedience, but about thinking, that learning to question, to analyze, to understand their own history was the most dangerous thing they could do, which meant it was also the most important. She taught them that the Germans could occupy their city and burn their books and rewrite their textbooks, but they could not occupy the space inside a person's mind where knowledge lived. Some nights, after the students had left and Barbara sat alone in the darkness listening for patrol boots on the street below, she wondered if she was doing enough. The forgeries saved individual lives. The intelligence reports might shorten the war by days or weeks, but this, teaching children their own language and history in whispered tones after curfew, this felt like saving something larger than individual lives. This felt like saving Poland itself, one forbidden poem at a time. Hauptmann Ernst Zimmermann began appearing at the school without warning in spring of 1943. Before that, inspections had followed a pattern, once every 3 or 4 weeks, usually on Tuesday mornings, announced the day before by a subordinate. But Zimmermann stopped announcing his visits. He would simply appear in the doorway during lessons, watching with pale blue eyes that registered everything and revealed nothing. Barbara felt his attention like a weight. He never accused her of anything, never questioned her directly. He would simply stand at the back of the classroom for 10, 15, sometimes 20 minutes, listening to her teach vocabulary or arithmetic, his presence transforming the air into something harder to breathe. Sometimes he would walk slowly between the desks, examining students' notebooks, running his finger along the spines of the approved textbooks on the shelf. Once he spent 5 minutes studying the portrait of Hitler on the wall, as if searching for some subtle defect in how it was displayed. The worst visits were the ones where he said nothing at all. He would arrive, observe, and leave without a word, his face expressionless. Barbara learned to read the small signs of his suspicion, the way his gaze lingered on the supply closet door, how he would pause near certain floorboards as if listening for hollow spaces beneath, the methodical way he checked whether books were arranged exactly as they had been during his previous visit. She began preparing for his arrivals, even when she didn't know they were coming. Every morning she checked the supply closet to ensure nothing appeared disturbed.
She examined the classroom from his perspective, looking for anything that might seem wrong, a book out of place, too much dust in some corners and not enough in others, the faint smell of candle wax that might linger from nighttime lessons. She coached her students on how to behave during his visits, eyes down, voices steady, no nervous glances toward hidden spaces. The psychological chess match between them became more elaborate. Zimmerman started asking seemingly innocent questions. How long had she taught at this school? Did she live nearby? Had she noticed anything unusual in the neighborhood, suspicious persons, unusual activities? Barbara answered with the truth whenever possible, knowing that lies could be checked against records. She kept her voice level, her hands still, meeting his eyes just long enough to seem honest, but not so long as to seem challenging. She understood what he was doing. He suspected something, but couldn't prove it. Perhaps someone had reported unusual activity at the school. Perhaps he had noticed small inconsistencies during his inspections. Or perhaps he simply trusted his instincts, and his instincts told him that this unremarkable schoolteacher with ink-stained fingers was hiding something worth finding. One afternoon in June, after a particularly long inspection, Zimmerman paused at the classroom door before leaving. He turned back to look at her, and for the first time he smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "You are a very good teacher, Fräulein Kaminska. Your students are so well behaved, so disciplined. One might almost think they have been trained." Barbara forced herself to return the smile. "Thank you, Hauptmann. I believe in the importance of order." He nodded slowly, still watching her. "Yes, order. I believe you do." After he left, Barbara stood alone in her classroom for a long time, listening to her own heartbeat, knowing that the game had changed and that eventually one of them would make a mistake.
The night Barbara sheltered 18 people in her school, she learned what silence truly meant. The warning came at 8 in the evening through Tomasz, who arrived at her apartment breathless and pale. The Gestapo was conducting a massive sweep of the Jewish quarter, not the usual random inspections, but a systematic building-by-building operation. Families who had been hiding in cellars and attics, protected by forged papers and the mercy of Polish neighbors, were being dragged into the streets. The resistance network was scrambling to find emergency shelter for anyone who could be moved before the sweep expanded beyond the ghetto walls. 18 people needed a place to hide until dawn. Barbara's school was the only option. She arrived at the building before they did, moving through rooms she could navigate blind, unlocking doors and checking sight lines from the street. The basement coal room could hold 8 if they sat pressed together. The supply closet behind the false wall could take 4 more. The library, if they stayed absolutely motionless behind the stacks, could conceal 6. She laid out blankets, set out water in tin cups, and placed a bucket in each space, because there would be no leaving, no matter what anyone's body demanded. They arrived in 3 groups between 9 and 10 o'clock, slipping through the back entrance 1 and 2 at a time. An elderly couple who moved slowly, the man's breath wheezing in the cold air. A mother with 3 children, the youngest no more than 5. 2 teenage brothers. A pregnant woman. Families Barbara had helped before with forged documents, people who knew her only as the schoolteacher who could make Jewish names disappear and Catholic ones appear in their place. She distributed them among the hiding spaces, whispering instructions. No talking, no movement, no coughing, no sneezing, no sound of any kind. If they heard boots on the stairs, they were to stop breathing if they could. The youngest children were given cloth to bite if they felt the urge to cry. Barbara gave the mother a small bottle of valerian drops to calm them if necessary. By 11 o'clock, everyone was hidden. Barbara sat alone in her dark classroom, listening to the night. The building settled and creaked around her. Outside, the city was eerily quiet under curfew, the kind of silence that meant people were hiding, waiting, praying. The patrol came at 2 in the morning. Barbara heard them before she saw them, boots on cobblestones, moving slowly down Marzalkowska Street. She watched from the window as their flashlights swept building facades, as they tested doors and peered into windows. There were 6 soldiers and an officer working methodically. They were checking everything. The boots stopped outside her school. Barbara's heart hammered so loudly she was certain it would wake the entire building. She heard voices in German, someone rattling the front door, testing whether it was locked. The flashlight beam swept across her classroom windows. She stood perfectly still in the darkness, not breathing, willing the 18 people hidden throughout the building to do the same. The boots tried the door again, this time harder. Then voices, a discussion. The flashlight moved away. The patrol continued down the street. Barbara waited another hour before moving, before checking on the people hidden throughout her school. They had not made a sound, not one sound. When dawn came and they left in the same careful groups they had arrived in, several people embraced her. Most simply nodded, too exhausted for words. At 8 a.m., Barbara stood at her blackboard teaching grammar to her morning class, her hands steady on the chalk, her voice clear. Only the shadows under her eyes suggested she had been awake all night, and shadows were common enough in occupied Warsaw that no one took to ask. Zimmerman came on a Tuesday morning in October 1944, and this time he brought 12 soldiers and 2 dogs. Barbara saw them through the classroom window, 3 trucks pulling up to the front entrance, soldiers spilling out with rifles, the dogs straining at their leashes. She had perhaps 2 minutes before they reached the second floor. In the supply closet behind the false wall, 23 forged identity documents were drying, their ink still wet from that morning's work. In the basement coal room, 4 resistance fighters were hiding, waiting until dark to move to another safe house. The library held coded messages she had been preparing to pass to a courier that afternoon. 2 minutes to decide what died and what survived. Barbara turned to her students with a calmness she did not feel. "Zofia, take everyone to the courtyard for morning exercise, now." Zofia understood immediately. Her face went white, but she stood and began organizing the younger students, her voice steady as she herded them towards the stairs. Barbara caught Tamash's eye and tilted her head towards the supply closet. He nodded once and disappeared. She could hear boots on the stairs now, multiple sets, moving fast. She walked to the classroom stove and began feeding it paper, lesson plans, old homework, anything that would burn. The coded messages from the library went in first, curling and blackening. She heard Zimmerman's voice in the hallway, sharp commands in German. Tamash reappeared with an armful of forged documents, his face panicked. "The ink," she said, "burn them. They would smear, but burned evidence couldn't be read." Tamash began feeding them into the stove while Barbara moved to the supply closet, pulling cleaning supplies forward to conceal the false wall, scattering dust and chalk across shelves to make them look undisturbed. The classroom door slammed open. Zimmerman stood in the doorway, 2 soldiers behind him, the dogs pulling forward with their handlers. His eyes went immediately to the stove, to the ashes of the papers she had burned, to Barbara standing calmly beside her desk with chalk dust on her hands. "Hauptmann," she said, inclining her head, "we were not expecting an inspection today." "No," he said, stepping into the room. "I imagine you were not." He gestured to the soldiers. "Search everything." They tore through the classroom with practiced efficiency, dumping drawers, pulling books from shelves, testing floorboards. The dogs moved methodically, sniffing along walls and furniture. Barbara stood perfectly still, watching them approach the supply closet, knowing that if the dogs detected anything, if the soldiers found the false wall, it was over. One of the dogs paused at the closet door, whining. Its handler opened the door, and the animal pushed inside, nosing through cleaning supplies. Barbara's heart stopped, but the dog found nothing except the smell of ammonia and lye soap, strong enough to mask other scents. Zimmerman walked slowly around the room, examining everything the soldiers displaced. He picked up a piece of chalk, rolled it between his fingers, set it down. He studied the blackboard where Barbara had been teaching verb conjugations. He looked at the stove, at the ashes of the paper she had burned. "What were you burning, Fräulein Kaminska?" "Old student work," she said. "We are running low on paper. I burn what cannot be reused." "In the middle of a lesson?" "I arrived early this morning. I was cleaning before class began." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to one of his soldiers and spoke in rapid German. The soldier nodded and left, returning moments later with another soldier dragging Pyotr by the collar. His face was bruised, his lip bleeding. "This student was found attempting to leave the building through a back window," Zimmerman said, "carrying these." The soldier held up a cloth bundle. Inside were 6 forged identity cards, the ink still wet, ready for distribution that afternoon. The room became very small. Barbara looked at Pyotr, at the cards, at Zimmerman's face. In the basement, 4 people were hiding. In this building were her students, her colleagues, everyone connected to her network. She could try to lie, to claim she didn't know about the cards, but Pyotr had been caught leaving her school. The forgeries would be traced back to this building, to this classroom, to her. She made her choice. "Those are mine," Barbara said quietly.
They took her that morning, hands bound, into a truck that smelled of diesel and fear. Zimmerman sat across from her during the ride to Gestapo headquarters, saying nothing, his pale blue eyes studying her face as if she were a puzzle he had finally solved but did not quite understand. The interrogations lasted 3 weeks. They wanted names, the students who had helped her, the families she had sheltered, the resistance contacts who would supply her with blank documents and intelligence. They wanted the entire network mapped and destroyed. Barbara gave them nothing. Not because she was particularly brave, though she was, not because she had been trained to resist interrogation, though she learned quickly. She gave them nothing because the moment she had said, "Those are mine," she had already made the only choice that mattered. She told them she worked alone, that she taught herself forgery from library books, that the students knew nothing, that they were children following a teacher's instructions without understanding what they carried. She repeated this story until the words became automatic, until she could recite it through split lips and bruised ribs, until even the interrogators seemed to tire of hearing it. In late November, as Soviet artillery began to reach the outskirts of Warsaw, Barbara was transferred to a detention facility 30 kilometers outside the city. It was not a death camp, but it was not meant for survival. She spent the winter of 1944 in a crowded barracks with 200 other women, eating watery soup and sleeping on wooden planks, listening to the distant thunder of the approaching front lines. She survived because she was useful. The camp commandant discovered she could teach, and even in a detention facility, there were children who needed basic education. Barbara spent her final months of captivity teaching the alphabet to the young daughters of guards, teaching them to read simple German primers, all while Soviet tanks drew closer each day. Liberation came in January 1945, sudden and chaotic. The guards fled in the night. Soviet soldiers arrived the next morning to find the gates open and the prisoners already walking away, moving like ghosts toward whatever remained of their former lives. Barbara returned to Warsaw in March, walking the final 30 kilometers because the trains were not running. The city she had known was gone. Her school stood as a burned shell, its roof collapsed, walls blackened by fire from the Warsaw uprising that had consumed the city while she was imprisoned. Her apartment building had been reduced to rubble. But teaching positions were opening up as the city began its slow, painful reconstruction. By September 1945, Barbara stood at a blackboard again, this time in a temporary school, housed in a building that had once been a warehouse. Her students were children who had survived the occupation, who had seen things no child should see, who carried losses no child should carry. She taught them grammar and mathematics and Polish history, the real history now, taught openly, in daylight. She never spoke publicly about what she had done during the war. When people asked, she said she had been a teacher, which was true. She said she had tried to help where she could,
which was also true. The full story remained locked behind her steady gaze and ink-stained fingers. 37 years later, in the autumn of 1982, Barbara Kaminska sat in her small apartment in Warsaw. 3 rooms in a concrete block building, books lining every wall, a window overlooking a street that had been rebuilt and renamed twice since the war. She was 73 years old, her hair white, her hands spotted with age, but still steady enough to grade papers from the primary school where she continued to teach part-time. The knock at her door came at 4 in the afternoon. She opened it to find Tomasz standing there, no longer a teenage courier, but a man in his 50s, with gray in his hair and a doctor's bag in his hand. Behind him stood 3 other people she recognized immediately despite the decades: Zofia, Piotra, Halina, and with them a dozen others she did not recognize at first, younger faces, children and teenagers who looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. "Pani Kaminska," Tomasz said, using the formal address he had used as a boy. "We wanted you to meet some people. These are our children. We thought it was time they knew the woman who made sure we survived to become their parents." Barbara stood in her doorway, looking at the faces crowded in the narrow hallway, and for a moment she could not speak. She had saved lives with forged papers and coded messages, yes, but more than that, she had saved futures. These children's futures, their children's futures, generations that would exist because one schoolteacher had decided that education meant more than conjugating verbs in an approved textbook. "Come in," she said finally, stepping aside. "All of you. I'll make tea, and then you can tell me what you have become." They filled her small apartment, sitting on chairs and floor, while Barbara moved among them with her teapot, listening to stories of lives lived in freedom, of careers and families and dreams realized. And late into the evening, when someone asked her to tell them about the war, about what it had been like, she simply smiled and said what she always said. "I was a teacher, and teaching, I learned, means giving people the tools to build their own lives. That's all I ever did." But Tomasz, watching her face in the lamplight, knew better. They all knew better. Barbara Kaminska had been a resistance fighter who never fired a shot, a soldier who fought with chalk and paper and the quiet courage of someone who believed that preserving a single life, a single truth, a single poem whispered after curfew was worth everything she had to give. And in the end, she had been right.
This story is inspired by real teachers and resistance networks in Nazi-occupied Poland. Though Barbara Kaminska is a composite character representing multiple educators who risked their lives during World War II. The secret teaching organization, Tajna Organizacja Nauczycielska, operated throughout occupied Poland from 1939 to 1945, with thousands of teachers conducting forbidden classes in Polish history, literature, and culture. The details of forged documents, hidden refugees, intelligence operations, and nighttime classes are drawn from documented historical accounts and survivor testimony. Many Polish teachers were executed for their participation in resistance activities, and countless others were imprisoned in concentration camps. The psychological and moral dimensions explored here, the recruitment of children into dangerous work, the constant surveillance, the impossible choices, reflect the actual experiences recorded in memoirs, historical archives, and testimony from those who survived. While Barbara Kaminska's specific story is fictional, it honors the memory of the real men and women who understood that education under occupation was not just about preserving knowledge, but about preserving humanity itself.